Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm hoping that you can hear me. Welcome to the sort of the last parallel session of this two-day Indeed forum. Really appreciate your time in joining us this afternoon, and I do hope that it can be pretty interactive as the session goes on, so that we get the most out of it for both the project and yourselves, obviously. My name is Martin Snowden. I'm the mediator for this session. I'm a new face to Indeed, so I'll just quickly introduce myself before introducing the more important people for this session. So I'm a senior research fellow and counter-terrorism lead at Centric, a research team within Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. But my background's actually in policing. I was a police officer for 30 years across a number of portfolios, but sort of most notably in counter-terrorism policing. And I was head of counter-terrorism policing for the northeast of England from 2017 to the summer of last year. So this sort of topic is always of interest to me. So the session, of course, is looking at the role of regional and national networks and platforms as tools for learning and improving practice. And hopefully, as well as the role of those networks and platforms, and indeed there might be an argument that there's more than just regional and national levels, will hopefully sort of draw out and look at sort of the value that they can or do bring, and how they operate and how they could be improved, all of course for those sort of better outcomes in the end, and then what evidence can we use to display that. So to achieve those sort of aims, we've got three speakers this afternoon, which I'll briefly introduce. So we've got Lotte Ralph, who's an EU doctoral researcher from the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Well, I know that the work's expanded sort of beyond Germany into sort of the pan-European context in the P&CVE infrastructures. Sophie Abeck is a research associate at the Global Public Policy Institute, and again has a number of sort of international insights from previous studies and teaching around the P&CVE landscape. And then Karen Svanberg, who's head of division at the National Council for Crime Prevention in Sweden, so really gives a government's sort of crime prevention program insight, which will be really useful for the session. So we're going to hear a couple of presentations and speech or talks this afternoon first, and then of course we do want you to get involved. So as we go, or at the end, please use the Q&A and the chat facilities. Or if you just want to put your hand up and speak, then we'll sort of pass you the mic, and you'll be able to interact with us there. So with that sort of frame setting over, I'm going to pass first to Sophie and Lotte, who are going to sort of give us our first input for this afternoon session. So thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. I hope you can see our presentation now. That is my colleague Sophie Abeck from the Global Public Policy Institute, and me, Lotte, from the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. We're very happy to present some research results from our PREVAL project in Germany to you today. And specifically, we will talk about some insights about support networks, as this is the title of the session. But these insights will come from a survey that was done within this project. It is an international P&CVE expert survey covering 14 different countries. And we think that this research really has value for policy and practitioners alike. So First of all, regarding Prewahl, because this could also be seen as some sort of network because we really value talking to practitioners and learning together in Germany. Prewahl is a research and transfer project, that's how we call ourselves, which further develops and redesigns formats and structures to strengthen evaluation and quality management in Germany. And we do this in 3 topic areas: in extremism prevention, in so-called democracy promotion, and in civic education in Germany. And it is really a collaborative effort. So we're overall 15 institutions, and our overall goal is to jointly with practitioners in dialogue, carry out research that is really demand-oriented and develop these new formats like a help desk or networks where we can collaborate together and strengthen evaluation practice within Germany. And this is also why this collaborative effort is also why we call our projects Future Labs and invite numerous individuals and institutions to participate in really co-designing our formats and providing space for dialogue. And from the very beginning, we were convinced that there is much to learn from the international context as well, which can then also contribute to strengthening German evaluation practice. And at the same time, I mean, maybe that's an observation that some of you share with us, we saw a gap in terms of international comparative research on PCV evaluations. So while there are some knowledge hubs within countries, some regional networks on this, there is little known internationally how other countries deal with PCV evaluations and little ground to learn from each other in that sense. So it's rather fragmented right now. And seeking to change that, we thought that we would synthesize such knowledge with the motivation to strengthen PCV evaluation knowledge and research. And therefore, we designed and conducted an international survey with 38 PCV experts from overall 14 countries in different world regions. And specifically, we were interested in identifying challenges regarding PCV evaluations, but also to find out what innovative solutions exist and whether we can gain a better understanding of evaluation structures, of methods, and capacity building in other countries. And before we present some of our findings on knowledge networks and expert networks now, we want to, spend a few words on our methodology, because our survey does not claim to determine representatively how intervention and evaluation landscapes are structured in particular countries, but we also included a lot of open-ended questions. We really engage with our experts, and we got some insights in each country's prevention landscape, context-specific structures on evaluation and quality assurance, as well as innovations and knowledge networks, which we will focus on today. And it was conducted via Lime Survey, which some of you might be familiar with. And we specifically approached experts who had previous experience in PCV evaluations, which was a bit difficult. And then we also invited a minimum of 2 experts per country. So again, in total, our data consists of 38 experts in 14 countries. And now, finally, my colleague Sophie will tell you something about our findings regarding the networks.
Yeah, thank you, Lotte. So as my colleague already indicated, we're only going to present a brief snapshot of the overall survey results. The actual survey is much more comprehensive, but some of the interests that we are looking at were also the role of support structures, including knowledge networks and PCVE networks. And what we found is that there's actually a possibility to use such networks, especially for capacity building. And we're going to explain a little bit today how we arrived at this finding. So before I get into some of the opportunities and challenges for PCVE networks, I want to briefly explain why we're even looking at that. So why are we talking to you today? When we asked our survey respondents what types of formats or structures for support, specifically for evaluation and quality assurance, exist in the scope of extremism prevention and civic education, we found that across context, most countries or most respondents stated that support networks were among the most frequently represented support structures, followed by trainings and also toolkits. A few of them we already discussed in the course of this conference, but really the most frequently available support structures were support networks. When we then asked survey respondents to elaborate a little bit more why they considered support networks to be, or which support structure they considered to be the most valuable, they most often stated that formal and informalized networks were the ones that they were most useful to them in their everyday work. So when we talk about networks, we deliberately did not provide any sort of definition. Again, as Lotta explained, we have an explorative approach, so we want to learn as much as possible. But usually when we talk about networks in the context of the presentation today, we refer to structures and formats that enable knowledge sharing, collaboration, and also coordination efforts. And these could be formalized. For instance, we can think about the Radicalization Awareness Network that probably most of you will be aware of, but also research conferences, and also informalized support structures, for instance, one-on-one context, so personal context that you have, that you've been working on and that you're working with and you know have experience in evaluation and quality assurance, or also what we saw in some context, WhatsApp groups for practitioners, for instance, where knowledge exchange also happens. We then also asked our survey respondents, based on previous research, about capacity gaps, and we asked specifically what they felt, which qualifications needed to be strengthened the most to improve the quality and also frequency of evaluation and quality assurance within the context of PCVE. And there they stated that foremost, what needed to be strengthened is methodological skills, so know-how about how to conduct evaluation and also the value of evaluation, and then theoretical knowledge on radicalization, violent extremism, and also related factors. And what we see is that because support networks enable knowledge sharing and they exist so frequently across different country contexts, we see an opportunity to use these spaces for knowledge exchange and building capacity. Before I get into some of the opportunities and challenges that were mentioned by our survey respondents, just very briefly, what we noticed was that there aren't any specialized PCVE evaluation networks. So our survey respondents were asked to provide examples of local, regional, and also international networks. We included some examples here of local and regional networks because that's the focus of today's session. And among those that they were mentioned were a huge variety of PCVE and CT networks, but none of them had a specific evaluation focus. And this is something that also coincides with findings from other Preval consortium partners. So we have a few other colleagues that recently released a working paper on knowledge networks, specifically in the German context. And there they also found that there exist PCVE networks. Some of them have punctual experience with evaluation and quality assurance. In Germany, we also have evaluation-specific networks, and they might have punctual experience with project-related work, but there isn't really this mixture of PCVE evaluation-specific networks. So evaluation might still be discussed in the context of PCVE networks, but it's always usually addressed as a number of issues that is discussed in those spaces. So some examples, again, this is a very brief overview. The actual amount of networks that was named is much larger than that. But we have, for instance, the Australian-based research network for addressing violent extremism and radicalization to terrorism. We have the coordination model of local crime and drug preventative efforts in Norway, or the Urban Area Security Initiative, which was launched by the Department of Homeland Security in the US, which basically aims to increase the capacity of high density in higher threat urban areas to prepare them for terrorist attacks and catastrophic events. And on regional level, we have, for example, the Center of Excellence for the Prevention and Countering of Violent Extremism of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is an East Africa based network. We have the Southeast Asian Network for Civil Society Organizations. We have RAN, or the European Expert Network on Terrorism Issues, which is a consortium of terrorism experts. So all of these are just a few examples on PCV USCT networks, some of which do have evaluation components. So for instance, Sean CSO does provide guidelines to civil society organizations on how to conduct evaluation, but this is not really their main objective. And then another interesting thing that we found is that whenever we talked about support structures, the importance of having personalized interactions and using personalized context was really emphasized. So on the one hand, survey respondents really stated that they wanted to build on personal context that they had built over time. So just interactions with fellow colleagues that they knew had evaluation experience, but also in formalized settings. When we talked about conferences or workshops, they emphasized the need for having interactive elements. So really having the opportunity to engage with each other and to learn from each other. When looking at the opportunities that we see for support networks to be used as a space for capacity building, we want to highlight some of the positive elements that were stated to bring value from the perspective of our respondents. So what was emphasized the most in terms of why support networks are valuable to them was that they provide a space to promote mutual learning by sharing models of good practice that could be then implemented into other contexts or other initiatives, but also lessons learned and innovative evaluation methods and practice. And I think sometimes we tend to focus really on the best case scenarios. That's sort of the gold standard. But what really was also a part of this is being able to share frustrations, challenges, or obstacles that you are facing. So it doesn't always have to be about the best practices. It's also about engaging in dialogue with each other about challenges that are similar in other contexts as well. Survey respondents also emphasized that support networks allowed them to connect with each other. So again, this is building your own informal network that I mentioned earlier. And it's also really about connecting policy research and practice. And I think that's not something groundbreaking new, but really where we see the benefits for capacity building is better dialogue. So on the one hand, policy and research are able to hear the perspective from local implementers and their local realities on the ground, including specific programming challenges, which then helps to inform better policy recommendations for evidence regulations and evidence approaches. And on the other hand, of course, practitioners can benefit from the interaction with research to learn more about evidence-based working, evidence-based approaches to evaluation, and also how to conduct evaluations and what the value is. To some extent, we also found that at least in certain contexts, for instance, Canada and Australia, support networks also helped with the facilitation of the dissemination of evaluation results. So for instance, in Canada, it was emphasized that their PCV implementers and stakeholders have a small network that is sort of loosely coordinated in which practitioners, PCVE developers, implementers, researchers, and also public authorities and funders come together and everyone shares whatever they can about their evaluations that they've conducted. And this then also promotes transparency and lessons learned. However, we should emphasize that transparency is still a significant issue within the field. And this was also one of the things that came up in our survey. So this is only possible. We can only use support networks for facilitating the dissemination of results wherever that is even allowed. So most often than not, unfortunately, evaluation results are still being held back and not really made public for different reasons. And we had multiple respondents that had personal experiences with embargoes or also facing NDAs and were not allowed to share evaluation results or only to limited extent. So overall, just to briefly summarize, what we see is that support networks enable capacity building through knowledge sharing and also research sharing. And this is especially the case in contexts where other forms of support structures are missing. For instance, in the Czech Republic, it was noted that there aren't really that many other support structures available for evaluation quality assurance. And because PCVE support networks are so frequently distributed across contexts, at least this is one space where capacity building and knowledge exchange can happen. However, of course, this is not the solution to all. There are also some challenges and considerations that we found. The first one being that if there is an intention to formalize connections more broadly, there needs to be a certain amount of openness to do so, and also a commitment from individual stakeholders or individuals to bring forward such initiatives. We saw, for instance, in the case of, again, the Czech Republic, that in the past there had been multiple attempts of bringing stakeholders together, and this was usually faced with a lack of commitment, either from PCV stakeholders, but also especially government authorities. And over time, these initiatives either never really took off or went dormant. And this also led to frustrations of those individuals who tried to connect other stakeholders with each other, so that eventually the motivation was also gone to continue such efforts. We've seen similar experiences also in Tunisia, where in the past there have been attempts made by organizations, including from civil society, to connect stakeholders, to give them access to evidence, databases, and also more centralized support from the government. But this usually also didn't really manifest or instrumentalize in something serious, and eventually those initiatives went dormant as well. In Tunisia, we also have, of course, a specific political context, and there is we also see the issue of lack of accessibility to these types of knowledge sharing platforms. The PCVE landscape was basically described as a very exclusive club that consists of long established PCVE stakeholders have the trust of the government, and it makes it really difficult for local implementers and smaller initiatives that don't have these resources to connect with government authorities to enter the space. This is also true, for instance, in Canada, which is a very different political and social context, but there too, the PCVE landscape is made out of a relatively small amount of PCVE stakeholders. And it has been explained by the survey respondents that it's very difficult to get access. Accessibility can also relate to visibility, and this is something that came up in conversations we had with PCV experts in addition to the survey, where it was noted that especially for local and smaller implementers, it can be very difficult to be seen by organizations that, for instance, are responsible for organizing conferences or workshops or trainings, so you're just simply not being invited. And this, of course, goes to both ways. It's also difficult for organizations to identify who is my target audience and who do I need to invite, who's working in the space and would benefit from capacity building initiatives without leaving anyone out. And then also finally, it can relate to financial restrictions. This came up in the context of the US, where it was emphasized how important it is to have, for instance, financial support for conferences, which is one of the spaces where capacity building can take place through panel discussions or, again, workshops. But of course, this is something that you need to be able to afford and can create a barrier. This is also true for the German context. Again, I was referring to that working paper from our colleagues earlier. It is in German, but if anyone is interested, Lotta and I are more than happy to provide a link to the document or connect you with the authors. But basically in that study, it was also emphasized that some support networks, specifically also for evaluation, require a membership fee, and therefore this can also create a barrier, especially to stakeholders with more constrained budgets. This is not only the case for Germany, of course, even though this did not specifically come up in our survey. We can look at the US, for instance, where the American Evaluation Association also has a membership model that gives paying members access to e-learning resources or networking opportunities that the general public would not have otherwise. And then finally, it was also noted, at least by some respondents, that we see an increasing fragmentation of the PCVE landscape, and this is partially due to a growing and developing field, which I want to state is a positive development. We see more and more initiatives, an increasing amount of stakeholders being represented, which is great. But it was noted that this has now led to sometimes initiatives having overlapping efforts, very similar objectives, which means that they're not always as resource effective as they could be. So sometimes a project which does great work ends because of funding cuts. And then a few years later, if we're lucky, it is being picked up under a different name with a different consortium. And then all the connections are being lost, and basically the project starts from zero, even though the objectives are very similar. And another side effect of this is also that especially evaluation experts, we briefly mentioned it yesterday, someone mentioned it in the chat, we don't have that many PCV evaluation experts. So those that we have are really needed at every corner, and they often have multiple hats on. They chair working groups, they are on multiple advisory boards, they have to attend conferences, and then also stay up to date with the latest research on top of their everyday activities. And that really means that they're limited in the active participation that they can offer because they are needed on so many bases.
All right, thank you, Sophie. We're now going to finish with some recommendations that we kind of drew out of these challenges that Sophie just mentioned. And we would start with a recommendation that we really need to streamline efforts with similar initiatives, because we want to ensure the sustainability of knowledge and practitioners networks and not just reinvent the wheel every single time. So this can be done, for example, by extending the existing efforts instead of developing ever more new projects with previously addressed objectives. And this is also very useful since we know from our research that established networks are often regarded as the most reliable partners. So practitioners want to go to these reliable partners and not just like have another network that they can turn to. Second, we also suggest that when needed, knowledge and practitioner networks should be more accessible. As Sophie pointed out, accessibility is often a key issue. And this can mean two things. It can mean that that travel costs could be funded, for example. This was a key issue named by respondents of the US, for example. Or it should also mean that currently underrepresented stakeholders could be called out and could be ensured that these can also participate in those events, that their perspectives are heard, and that capacity building efforts reach all relevant actors, especially those smaller PCV implementers with limited experience in the field. However, we also acknowledge that opening up existing restricted networks also comes with risks and barriers, and these, of course, need to be reflected beforehand. Third, the visibility of support networks could be increased by promoting relevant evaluation expertise more clearly. So when we hear of these peer-to-peer exchanges, ideas, and the like, we should really focus on how to make them visible, how to show practitioners that these offers are out there and that they're really useful and valuable for them. And then lastly, regarding research, there are still some gaps to address. So what, for example, makes different kinds of support structures efficient? How are they being used? What kinds of strengths do different types of networks have? And what is currently lacking to strengthen the evaluation capacities more effectively? And this is a good transition because in PREVA, we're currently also working on a case study on best practices for the implementation of support structures for PCV evaluation. So when are these effective and how can we make them even more effective? So stay tuned for that. And then we're also going to present some more results of this extensive survey that we only had a sneak peek of today at our PREVAL Fachtag, which is at the end of this month. It is in German, but for all of you who are able to speak German or to listen to German, we highly recommend this event, which will also be broadcasted through a live stream. And yeah, thank you very much for listening to us today. If we do have time in the end, or if you do not have that many questions, of course, we're happy to answer all the questions you have. But we really encourage you to think about this question or these two questions. In your experience, what are success factors for support networks and what hinders effective capacity building? We would be very interested in hearing your maybe also international views on these two questions. Thank you very much.
Well, Sophie, thanks ever so much. Really insightful presentation there. It's drawn out some really key bits. So for the people in the session, they've obviously posed two questions. You've probably got a bit of time to think, but we really would like that sort of feedback into the chat or Q&A, whether it's a comment or you draw out some further questions into that. But I can certainly see some questions coming from the research and the presentation that we've had there, because it really is quite thought-provoking. I'm not seeing any questions directly now, so I think we'll move on and give people time to think, and then we can come back to questions towards the end. So, Karen, can I pass to you, please?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be involved in this large event. It's really exciting. I will take the opportunity now to the 8 minutes I was given to sort of grasp just how some examples of how the Swedish crime prevention is moving against a more evidence-based, or maybe we should say a knowledge-based practice, and on all levels, and how this is supported, and how and what is needed to enhance the understanding of evidence and knowledge in crime prevention practice. And I really want to stress that these examples, it's not necessarily good examples, but they stand for some path to take, or the path that has evolved during some 2 decades or something like that. And I will start with a more general example, and that is that Swedish crime prevention is since 2010 or so, more or less building on a bottom-up approach, which means that you work on the ground with on a really local level with the SARA model, or what we call a knowledge-based process, which starts with an assessment of the crime problems, and an analysis of the problems and the causes, and then you match or maybe already present initiatives to prevent those problems, or you initiate new ones. And then you're supposed to follow up or evaluate those initiatives. And that National Council for Crime Prevention has been giving support to that kind of knowledge-based crime prevention ever since. And of course, when you do this stage in this process where you should choose what to do, there's always this demand for where is the knowledge bank, or the knowledge, where do I look for the knowledge on what to do towards this problem. And I've heard that demand for 20 years or so, and it's of course there are international banks of knowledge, but the problems with those is that they are either, as you told recently here, Lotta and Sophie's excellent results, that it's bigger initiatives. It's not those ground level initiatives that you look for when you're doing local crime prevention. So keep this in mind, that this is often something that the demand for this knowledge bank is something that we have heard for a long time. I'll come back to that. So I also want to mention that since the 1st of July this year, there's a crime prevention law for municipalities in force in Sweden. And the law is more or less exactly what I explained earlier, that they should work this knowledge-based process. It means that each municipality must pursue a knowledge-based crime prevention, and also, of course, ensure the organizational and structures for that kind of work. That means the work since 2 decades, and this law makes that the demand for crime prevention models and evaluated crime prevention methods are, as I said, asked for a lot. But what we see is that you can't really match evaluated model when you haven't done the first 2 steps in the process. And that is the getting the knowledge of the local crime situation and the analysis of the reasons or for that prevention. And there is an unequal readiness. We have 290 municipalities in Sweden. They are from 3,000 inhabitants to over 1 million inhabitants. So it's really different prerequisites for doing this. But there is an unequal readiness to follow this process. And this will probably divide the results of this law, even that we think that this will push the process against a more knowledge-based and hopefully also evidence-based crime prevention in Sweden. And we hope to give support, as also Lotta and Sophie mentioned, the support structure is so important to make this happen. And we hope to, for example, give support, knowledge support regarding evaluations, but also, of course, the mapping of the crime problem and the analysis of the crime problem. So this law sounds easy and maybe also far away from an evidence-based model, but it isn't actually. When you're on the ground, this is not something that is very easily made. So, a lot of municipalities in Sweden claim that they already do this, but we have quite good evidence that most of them don't do even the first two steps in this process. For example, regarding when you look at what kind of measures you initiate regarding young persons on the way into criminal groups. We don't lack the knowledge on what to do there, but those kind of initiatives aren't made. So there's something missing here. There's more, the situation in the municipalities is more so that you look for the cheapest way out and instead of building knowledge-based crime prevention. So we have to have respect for the situation on a local level also, of course. But the National Council for Crime Prevention is appointed to make yearly follow-ups of this law and how it's implemented. And the first follow-up is going to be made next year. So I hope that I can come back to you with results on how this is going forward in Sweden. Well, that was the first example, and it leads me directly into the other one, because what we see lacks the most is the last step in the knowledge-based circle, and that's the follow-up or the evaluation of the initiatives. So since about 2015, the National Council for Crime Prevention gives micro grants for evaluation of small-scale, on-ground, local crime prevention initiatives. And those initiatives should be built on this knowledge-based approach, or the SARA model, or whatever you want to call it. It has many names. And since one of the tasks for the National Council is to spread knowledge, knowledge must be created somewhere. And it can't be invented in a laboratory. It must be invented in and adapted to the local prerequisites and resources. So the evaluations done, that we give these small grants. I will give you some example. It could be like initiatives regarding youth outreach work, or in a specific context, or driver's license schools, or what do you call it, driving schools, helping neighborhood watch, neighbors with neighborhood watch, or local police initiatives to prevent open drug markets in a specific hotspot or something like that. So it should be really small scale evaluations on specific initiatives. And these small scale evaluation perhaps or not always make sense in themselves one and one, but aggregated, they are. We are steady and slowly building knowledge to a macro level from this micro initiative, micro evaluations. We now have a body of evaluations regarding, for example, prevention of youth crime, prevention on specific hotspots, prevention, well, regarding a lot of areas. So now we're up to the task that we can sort of aggregate them and synthesize them to a bigger knowledge and withdraw components that are more likely to be possible to implement, that are more prone to give good results and so forth. That is what we do to enhance the knowledge on to the local level by giving small grants to evaluation. And it's often universities that cooperate with the municipalities on doing these evaluations. And when we talk about bigger initiatives that needs more large-scale research programs, the National Council for Crime Prevention, of course, we ourselves have a research department. They do evaluations on crime prevention initiatives. But we also, as we are giving support to crime prevention, we also sort of see to that large-scale evidence is made on bigger initiatives in Sweden. And that's my last example. And that's focused deterrence strategies to prevent gang and group-related violence in Sweden. I don't know if you've heard about the stressing Swedish situation. We have an emerging problem with gang-related violence since some decades in Sweden, and it's has now gone to a huge problem. But despite that, with all the international and national evidence of the effectiveness of focused deterrence, that is still hard to implement and to spread in Sweden. We've given support to implement it in some cities in Sweden. And it's obvious that it's relevant to have some courage to do something like that and to embrace even the strongest recommendations from research with even this kind of problem that is so affecting the whole Swedish society right now. And the first step to implement the focused deterrence strategy was in Malmö. It had the international research as a foundation, and the openness to this research, I think, this is my personal analysis, depending on who were talking to who about this evidence. It was not the evidence in itself. It could be interpreted all ways, but someone was open for implementing it when they heard about the research. The basic facts or the figures or the evaluations or the evidence is not enough in itself. Luckily, it was in Malmö and in some other cities open to try this, and in some other cities the openness is not at all the same. So how do you create that openness is sometimes more crucial than how you present the facts. And the person-to-person meetings in spaces where it feels secure to ask those dumb questions might be one way. So it must, big scale networks might not be the way. It must be somewhat smaller, I think. And I totally agree on what Michael Patton said yesterday, that making evidence is not the hard it's not the hard bit. It's making the sense of the evidence that's the hard bit, and making it work in a very so to speak, when we talk about gang-related violence in Sweden, it's a very stressful situation. So to sort of get through that and talk about the evidence is maybe harder than creating the evidence. And that was my third example, and I think I've totally gone over my time, so I will round up there.
Karen, thanks ever so much. No, it was it's timed fine. It was interesting input. So just going slightly over is useful. I can see we've got one question in the Q&A, but whilst it's still sort of fresh in my mind, Karen, can I just come back to you? Obviously, these topics around the role of regional and national networks, I'll perhaps expand into local later because Sophie and Lotta referenced that. I think we've got a benefit because you're obviously part of a national platform or network in Sweden. But you touched on there or seemed to suggest that there wasn't that support network infrastructure in Sweden for crime prevention. Are there any sort of national and regional networks for other crime types such as POCVE? You mentioned gang violence. Are there any models out there of those sort of national, regional and local platforms or support structures?
I come back to that, what was mentioned about the definition of network here, because I think there exists a lot of networks, both on national, regional and local level. But do you mean networks on evaluation?
No, I mean, I would say it's broader. I think evaluation is one part of a network requirement and a support requirement and an improvement requirement. I mean, everything that a network or a platform or whatever should do is to, in my mind, is produce improvements and benefits and outcomes for individuals and sort of communities. So I think it's wider than evaluation.
Okay, I think we have a lot of networks actually, and some of them are initiated by the National Council for Crime Prevention and the PCVE. Oh, sorry if I don't get that right. Network is sort of built up by our sister unit that is called Center for Preventing Violent Extremism, that is located just beside us in the same building. So we have networks.
So is it a case that evaluation is not integral to those at this moment in time? Do you think is that the main issue for you?
Yeah, I would say that maybe evaluation is not the main topic. The main topic within those structures is what should we do with this problem, and not really where are the evaluations done and how. Okay.
Thank you. That's really useful. I know I'm trying to steal the floor again, and I will come to the question that's in the chat, but if I just sort of then roll that into Lotta and Sophie's presentation, and just picking up on Karen's point again there, when we're talking around regional and national networks and platforms, you were obviously looking at the sort of the PNCVE space predominantly. Did you find any consistency around what exactly a network or a platform is? Did they know what the roles were, even in individual countries? Did they know how they interacted with each other or should interact? What was your sort of view on that connectivity, even within one country? Perhaps we'll come on to comparable models internationally, but how did it look sort of in individual countries first, please?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, to follow up on the previous comments, I think what we observed particularly was that there are very few networks that focus solely on PCV evaluations, right? So it's mostly, maybe it's centered around PCVE, as this was the topic we were focusing on. And then in one session, they focus on evaluation and discuss that. Or the other extreme, it is a knowledge hub for evaluation. And then they also look at different areas of field where they can apply this evaluation knowledge to. And then, as you said correctly, there are very few countries where there exist distinct PCV evaluation expert networks in whatever form that might entail. So whether it's a formalized, institutionalized kind of network, or whether it's this really informal structures, I think there might exist some structures within countries, but even those are rarely connected, or rather still in knowledge silos, so to speak.
Okay.
Maybe Sophie, if you want to add to that, or do you disagree?
I mean, I do agree, but I was also just reflecting, Martin, you made a comment on, do they know what type of networks exist? And I think this also relates to what Karen was just saying. There are networks, but it also depends a little bit on how we define them. So especially when we talk about informalized networks, so this could be literally one-on-one contacts. I know that you have done an evaluation before. I met you at a conference, you spoke about it, and I can send you an email, I can call you up. These types of exchanges I do think exist across countries, but again, this is an accessibility argument, right? You need to have access to those types of experts. You need to engage with them before to establish these personal contacts. When we talk about more formalized networks, there are numerous PCVE networks, and I think many of them we are aware of. But as Lotta mentioned, the extent to which evaluation is discussed there depends very greatly. So we know, for instance, the Radicalization Awareness Network is a good example that has in the past done workshops and also brought out policy papers that focused on how to do evaluations or best practices. But this is an individualized effort, right? This is not representative of what RAN stands for. It's just one of the many issues that they address. Or they do have a database where you can look for practitioners. And we did use this actually for the survey as well. You can search for evaluation. So if I know as a PCV implementer this expert database exists, I can go there and from a drop-down menu select evaluation and see which experts are in my region. But this is also all knowledge or know-how that you need to have, which a lot of local implementers that are busy with their everyday work and are very removed from this policy and research space, so sort of our bubble that is represented also in this panel, they don't have access to that. And these access barriers, I think, is a significant challenge.
Okay, that's really interesting. We'll perhaps go to the couple of questions that are in the Q&A. I'm not sure. Can we bring that up on the screen? I'm not sure. There we go. So, Garazia, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly there, from Ethiopia. Do not see any meaningful regional networks in improving practices with regards to other regions. Is that possibly outside of the EU? What do you think the problems are? I presume in sort of creating these, is it something relating to budget or economic reasons? Is there any comments there from the sort of speakers and panel, please?
So maybe I'll just give a brief input if that's okay, if I may take the stage again. So we do see examples of this. So I mentioned Sean CSO, the Southeast Asian Network for Civil Society Organizations that also have evaluation experience and expertise that they use, for instance, for these handbooks that I was referring to earlier. In Indonesia, they we have seen a recent development, which is the IK Knowledge Hub, which is a website, but it's really meant to be a collaborative platform where PCVE stakeholders can go to connect with each other, but also to receive resources. And part of that is on evaluation and monitoring. So there are these individualized efforts that also exist outside of the EU. I'm not sure it's only funding. I think that's an argument we can make probably for many questions. I think it might relate more to the fact that we're talking about a field, so PCVE evaluation, that is still very much in the development stage. The reality is that most projects are not being evaluated, and that in most country context, evaluation is still regarded as either a tick box exercise or an afterthought. So this awareness for the role of evaluation has not developed to the extent it has in other fields. These could be related, like crime prevention is a bit more ahead, but it could also be unrelated, like medicine. So I think it's more related to that issue, that evaluation hasn't received the attention that it requires.
Okay. Lotte, Karen, anything you wanted to add there? It is actually linked in some respects, all of them. So you may answer the next one. We've got a question from Dennis in the Q&A chat about national networks, and are there any existing or any network for African countries, and what global networks are available, and how can one join? Did you see anything from your sort of research that would be a docking point for some of the African countries?
So in terms of African countries, we looked at Ivory Coast and Kenya in particular. However, there were like these experts that we surveyed in these countries did not name any national networks to us, which actually points to a factor that was quite common in African countries and also in other world regions that were not part of Europe or the US. And actually, what's interesting is that in African countries, for example, we see a lot of donor organizations or countries being active in the PCVE field that also then conduct PCV evaluations, USAID, for example, is conducting evaluations frequently. And I think this could be something where these donors could initiate networks and involve in a very dialogical format also practitioners and PCV experts that are locals to form and initiate such expert networks. I think that would be highly valuable, but they're not yet existent, unfortunately. But maybe events like this today can give you some inspiration to do so.
Yeah.
Maybe if I could just add to that. So what Lotte was just saying, we didn't identify any specific PCVE networks. What we do know of 2 examples, but these are government-led. So it's more an institution, not so much a network. So at the Ivory Coast in 2021, the country, in collaboration with the French government, established the Center for Counterterrorism that serves sort of also as a regional hub on counterterrorism issues, but it's much more an institution. It also provides training, not so much a network per se. And then in Tunisia, one respondent also mentioned the Commission on Terrorism Issues, which has a longer French name that I'm sorry, I can't pronounce. But again, this is a government body that also deals with these issues, more specifically on CT or PCVE, less so on evaluation.
Okay. Thank you. I can't see any more questions in the chat at this moment in time. So I'll just sort of urge people just to remember those 2 questions that were posed by Lotte and Sophie. I do have another one then, if I may, which is around your sort of the 3 of you, really, your experience of sort of networks, and again, we've got a problem possibly of definition in some respects of what does that actually mean, and what do platforms mean. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think there's more than just national and regional. There's definitely local. because some of the biggest wins are those local face-to-face relationships and those service providers in whatever, whether it's PCV, whether it's crime prevention, whether it's any other gang-related violence is certainly an area where you've really got to get down into sort of community provision and community engagement in some respects. But just your experience around those platforms or networks at various levels, did you get an understanding of how they work on a practical level, both internally, and then whether there was any connectivity between the different sort of levels, and then particularly since we've been talking about evaluation, what was their approach to evaluation? I know you've just touched on that briefly. Were they keen to do it? Were they worried about it? Was it sort of front and centre? Were they happy for external evaluations, or did that come with a big dose of suspicion and concern? So I know I'm wrapping a lot into that, but it'll just sort of give you free rein, I guess, in some respects. If it's clear enough to answer.
I can just give a quick answer. There's, since the model that we are talking about in crime prevention is so much about collaboration and networking, when you do crime prevention, is often asked that, okay, are the government cooperating and the other levels also cooperating, or is it just the local level that are required to cooperate? So more and more there are, well, I would say network actually, but it's mostly governmental and authorities network between sort of interdepartmental, would you say that? Like between ministries. Authorities under ministries are cooperating more and more to give the support to initiatives more mainstreamed and talk the same language. And I think that is perhaps the most practical you get, as practical as you get on a national level, to sort of give the support mainstreamed.
Yeah, just to kind of ask. So you were asking about how these internal processes work, on how the networking in itself works,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, what we did with the survey was just to kind of assess the current state of like which networks exist, and whether they exist more in a formalized way and like in an institutional way, or whether there are some informal networks, like Sophie mentioned, with the like WhatsApp chats kind of communication. So that is as much as we know about how they work. We do know from more like anecdotal evidence that there is also a lot of sensitivity around these communications. So practitioners, especially in those really close, restricted networks, they prefer to keep those barriers, and they won't let many people look into them, since we're dealing with very sensitive topics. And this also involves, or increasingly involves, multi-agency kind of cooperation and networks, which obviously have even, it's a good development that they increasingly exist, but they're also dealing with extremely sensitive situation across multiple agencies. So we, based on our survey, we can't give much of an answer there, just some anecdotal evidence, but it would be highly interesting to go into detail in these networks that we identified, and potentially see whether there's something to learn on how they really actually work.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see whether some of the networks and the platforms, you would expect it at the national level, it's slightly harder at the local level, whether there is a clear definition of what their role should be, what their output should be, what their deliverables should be, so that, you know, you do, particularly when it's multi-agency and multi-partner, sometimes gets missed in interpretation there about who's bringing what in terms of information, data, and who can share what, and what you're trying to achieve collectively. What's that joint effort designed to look like? So it would be a really interesting next step to see whether some of those networks, or whatever we call them, perhaps we need a clearer definition of what that actually is, how they operate. You know, have they got sort of terms of reference or MOU, or a clear vision statements in terms of what they're trying to achieve? I appreciate there are sensitivities around some of those topic areas, but I don't think we'll be asking for anything sensitive. It's just how they would operate in broad terms, really, to support each other. Yeah. Okay. Have we any further questions? I can't see anything in there. No. Does anyone want to just raise a hand quickly to see before we possibly wrap up in some respects? No. Okay. I won't sort of push too much with that. Just as we potentially close, then I don't know whether Sophie, Karen, Lotte, I want to make any sort of final comments or final asks of people to get in touch with you and try and answer those two questions, certainly for Lotte and Sophie that you raised. I know you've put some. We've got some obviously communications and connectivity details. If people wanted to get in touch with, I think that would be probably useful both ways around, wouldn't it? Yeah. Okay. I think what I'll do is, rather than drawing it out, we're sort of about 10 minutes short of our allotted time, but it'll perhaps give you a little bit more of a break before the final wrap-up session, which I think is at 4:30. Is it, for sort of the next steps for Indeed, and so the conclusion? Oh, it's actually at 4:20, so it's 4:20. So you'll just have a sort of a 5 or 10 minute break before coming back into the final session, which is looking at that charting the way forward, which will probably sum up the last couple of days with the session. So Sophie, Karen, Lotte, can I just thank you for your really insightful inputs this afternoon? Thank you for the questions that have come forward. I think it's been really useful, and clearly there's it would be really interesting on both sides to sort of see some of the inputs in due course as the research progresses or the legislation progresses in Sweden, Karen. It's a really interesting next step. So thanks for your time this afternoon, you three, and thanks for everybody who's been in the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.